Now, if your company or customers continue to be impacted by the pandemic, economic or geopolitical issues, or even the current venture funding climate, the way you sell needs to change. And in this session, I'm going to be covering 3 tactics for connecting with customers during times of adversity, either adversity for us or adversity in the market. Now, these tactics aren't tricky, but they definitely require planning, conviction, and empathy to execute. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome back to another episode of Sales Lab Live. I'm David Priemer, and this is a very important and obviously timely topic for so many organizations right now, given what's going on in the world, given what's going on in business. And it's kind of interesting, we've always experienced adversity, and certainly in the last few years, it's kind of come up more and more and more. But, every organization goes through periods of adversity. Sometimes it's localized just to them. Sometimes it's something that's impacting the greater market. And it's really important to not only understand the right mindset to execute with during these kinds of times, but the tactics that you can use to better focus your time and resources. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, at the risk of getting into a little bit of slidage, here's what we're going to talk about. Now, the first thing, let's just get right into it. The first thing, when we think about getting into these times of adversity, how should we sell? The first thing I want you to recognize is that trust and selling with empathy during times of adversity actually produces a biochemical reaction, especially in the mind of our customers. Now, just to kind of take a step back for a second, one of the things that we know now about how humans behave is that, and I want you to think about this, you can probably remember when life didn't go that well for you. Maybe you had a hard day, maybe you had a bad diagnosis, or you were going through some kind of personal tragedy. You can probably remember with vivid detail what actually happened during those specific moments. Right? We generally don't remember the times where everything was like smooth sailing and everything, no worries. We remember the times where things didn't go our way. This is actually a biochemical reaction. It's actually evolution's way of teaching us how to get out of sticky situations. So what happens is when you're in a very tough spot, your brain and the chemicals in your brain essentially hit record. And it does that so that it basically telling you, hey, look, if you ever find yourself in a tough spot like this again, you're now going to remember with vivid detail the steps that you took, hopefully, to get out of that tough spot. And I say that to say is like right now, when you are going through adversity, or more specifically, your customers are going through periods of adversity. Maybe you're calling on an organization that just had to do a layoff, or maybe they work in the hospitality space, and this is kind of like at the beginning of the pandemic, right? All these bad things. The way you treat people during those times matters because they are going to remember, right? They will have long memories. They'll remember when the pandemic is over, when the economic situation is over, when the geopolitical issues are over, they'll remember how you treated them. So it's really important to really nail these things and really take them to heart. So that's kind of what I just want to say around trust. It's a biochemical reaction, and how you treat people during times of adversity really matters. The first thing that we're going to talk about as it relates to how to execute during times of adversity, so we're in sales, we're trying to reach out and connect with our customers. The first thing I want to talk about is this concept of acknowledging and empathizing. And you saw a lot of this happening during the early stages of the pandemic when people were ringing each other up and saying, hey, are you okay? Like, are you isolating? Hope your family's okay. I know it's been tough for us. We're all working remotely nowadays, right? Even calling up customers saying, hey, look, I know like the venture funding climate, I know you're a VC funded company. It's been really tough. It's been tough on us too. We're a venture funded company. Just acknowledging and empathizing with their journey. And there's a lot of lessons that we learned around this in the pandemic. And I wrote an article, which you're happy to look up. I'm happy to have you look up. It's called, how to 3 objection handling lessons from pandemic politics. And the idea was, when you see a lot of these press conferences that happen during the pandemic, where you have reporters and journalists basically questioning politicians about their choices for why are you forcing us to shut down this kind of business, or why are you doing this to us, or why did you make that decision? The best politicians are not the ones that immediately launch right into like the pitch or like, here's why we did it. They acknowledge and empathize, they soften, they say, oh my gosh, you know what, it's true, the pandemic has been so unfair to so many people. No one wants to see businesses shut down. And they kind of empathize, they acknowledge the problem for the customers, and they kind of dive in. And I think that's really, really powerful and important. Certainly when you're reaching out to customers proactively, acknowledging the situation that they might be in, even making some assumptions about the situation they might be in based on their industry, who they sell to. Very, very important. And this actually feeds into Our second point, before we start, again, selling things to people, is to personalize and prioritize. Meaning, we cannot, in times of crisis, sell necessarily to the same people that we sold to before, right? There could be issues where think about selling to hospitality or airlines at the beginning of the pandemic, right? They weren't buying anything, right? So being able to target them with like a new kind of message, like forget about it, right? Personalize and prioritize to the customers that you can help the most now, right? And when you reach out to them, you want to reach out to them with the right type of message that is aligned with what they are going through at the moment. And this kind of comes back to a concept that I talk about. I refer to this as full spectrum selling. And so the idea is to really think about what is it your customers value, right? When they buy your product or service, why would they make that decision? And if you think about each of these marbles represents a reason why a customer might buy your product or service. And, typically when we go out to market and we're just like blasting people with our message, we have like one particular reason that usually stands out that most people buy our product or service for. And we tend to lead with that. And that's the thing that we usually say. But I'm here to tell you, like during times of adversity and uncertainty, there might be other concerns that your customers have, right? And those concerns, represented by, reasons B through F, might be actually more important to them at that point in time than the main thing that you usually say. So for example, if you're selling into like a B2B technology company who's maybe venture funded, and now the funding climate isn't what it used to be, you might lead with a message and talk about how your product or service aligns with that challenge and how you can help the customer be more efficient during this time, solve that challenge. Again, you got to be careful here as I say efficient, because if you just say, oh yeah, like we help companies be more efficient, save money, which is really important now during these times, like, again, you don't want to sound like you're patronizing the customer, like your value proposition was just all too convenient, right? So it's got to be done. That's why I say it at the outset with care and empathy, but really focusing on what is your customer value? What do they value now that maybe they did not value before? And how are you leading with that message? How are you personalizing and prioritizing so that they feel, remember we talked about this whole idea of feelings, they feel that you understand them, right? And you didn't just reach out to them because they were the next person on your list. You're reaching out because at this point in time, there's a specific way that you can help them and their business and their journey. And even down to like the individual person, right? The individual person and their role and responsibilities changes during times of uncertainty, right? Maybe people are fighting for their jobs. Maybe they're struggling for relevancy. Maybe in a pandemic world where everything is now thrust online, the poor IT managers need some additional resources to cope with all the people working remotely. Like that's what I mean by personalize and prioritize. But it also means that if there are customers there that you cannot help now, right? There was customers in your pipeline that for whatever reason are not a good fit for you now because of the way that the world has changed, my advice is it's not time to focus on those customers, right? Like you might want to empathize and, and just touch base and, hey, look, I'm sorry for what's going on. I know it's been really tough. And like, I'm not trying to sell you anything, but personalize and prioritize also means saying no to certain customers. And in fact, I talk about this. I have a piece of content that was actually really popular. It's called Sell More by Losing Faster. It's a popular post on my blog as well. I have a bunch of videos that kind of surround it that have been embedded there. But this was based on some data around the fact that, when we have a focused pipeline, right? When we have focused pipeline, that customers that want what we have, that are a good fit for what we have, where we're reaching out with the right message, we actually win more. But the customers who take too long to go through discovery because they're not in the right mindset, they're not calling you back, they're not bringing the decision makers to the table, and sometimes they're doing that because you're just not a fit for the time that you're in, for that time of adversity or uncertainty. It is not time to focus on those customers right now, right? And the science and research shows that when you can actually cut those customers out of your pipeline and focus on the ones you can actually help, your close rates, your attainment will increase. And I've had lots of clients who've been in this situation. I've been in this situation personally. I had one client who was a sales rep at a high-tech company who said, look, David, I had 300 opportunities. I realized I was running over the course of this next quarter, and I got really focused on the customers I thought I could really, really help. Cut that list down to 75 customers, and I hit over 300% of my number that quarter. So very, very powerful. Being able to personalize and prioritize is not just thinking about what is that customer value now, but also like who can I actually help and who should I actually be cutting out of my pipeline. So in addition to some of those resources, I do have this YouTube video, which you can check out. I know you may not want to write down the actual address here, but if you go to my YouTube channel, which is just Cerebral Selling, just look for this thumbnail and you will be good to go. All right, the third topic, the third thing that you need to keep in mind when you're selling to customers during periods of adversity, and this is just good practice all the time anyways, is make it okay for them to say no, right? Like your customers are going through a tough time right now, and the last thing that they want is a sales rep pushing a product on them that like maybe they don't want, they don't need, they can't afford. And look, in all fairness to you, maybe you don't know that yet. Maybe you don't know what their budget is. Maybe you don't know what the situation is at the customer. That's okay. You're going to have a conversation with the customer. And at the end of the conversation, if you make it okay for that customer to say no, it is actually more likely, scientifically speaking, for them to say yes. And there's tons of research that backs this up. And you know this and experience this on your own. When you, for example, go to like a clothing store. I love giving this example. You go to a clothing store, you go to the Gap, right? You go into the Gap to buy a t-shirt, and a salesperson comes over to you and says, excuse me, sir, excuse me, ma'am, is there something I can help you find, right? I like this picture from the car dealership, right? Where like the salesperson comes over, it's like, hello, like how can I help you, right? What do you typically say, right? When these kinds of situations, what do you typically say? You probably, if you're like most people, you probably say something like, oh, well, I'm just looking, right? Because the problem is if we tell people why we're actually there and why we want to, what we're actually looking at, we are basically giving the salespeople consent to do their sleazy sales things to us. And so we don't do that. We take a defensive position and say, no, I'm just looking. And this is actually a psychological principle known as reactance. And reactance is our intrinsic desire to push back when we perceive that our ability to choose freely is being restricted. Now, I actually covered this. I covered this in lots of different places in my curriculum. I actually covered this in one of our very first Sales Lab Live videos on the topic of, are your calls to action, are your CTAs actually pushing your customers away? And the idea is when we come up with a very strong call to action, like, oh, hey, David, how's next Wednesday at 2 p.m. for jump on a Zoom call and talk about A, B, and C? When we do that, it actually pisses our customers off and makes them more defensive, right? Because we're coming on really strong. It's like if I met you and asked you out on a date, but instead of asking you out on a date, I said, hey, how would you like to go, to this restaurant and do this and then see this movie and then get married and then maybe go away for the weekend? You'd be like, oh, easy there. Like, you're really infringing on my, ability to choose freely here. And you experience this when you even just go into a retail store and you get ambushed at the door and they say, oh, is there something I can help you find? And so the antidote, right? The antidote to reactance, when we feel that our ability to choose freely is being restricted, we lash out, right? It's like a sign that says no, wet paint on a wall. We look at the sign and we say, oh my gosh, like I got to touch that wall, right? Because the sign said I couldn't do it. The secret is you just give people permission to say no. And I actually talk about this in my book. If you've read my book, I talk about this concept of reactance. I also talk about it in this article, but the hidden force that sometimes pushes our customers away. But, again, if you want to be like a kind, empathetic, helpful seller, when you go out to your customers and you present them with, opportunities to invest in your product or service to help them get out of a tricky situation, you've empathized and acknowledged the problem that they're likely to be having, so you're a real human being. You've personalized and prioritized, so you've aligned the message with the experience that they're going through right now and decided whether or not you can help them and which customers you are not going to be able to help right now. And then you reach out with a good message, good conversation, you do your good discovery, but then give your customers permission to say no at the end of the day. We all know in sales, yes is the best answer, no is the second best answer, and we all know what the worst answer is, which is like maybe or ghosting, right? And so being able to kind of crystallize how you can help the customer, give them the option to say yes or no at the end of the discussion, very, very powerful. And the one final tip I will give you about this whole like saying no thing, it's really important to be mindful of where you actually use that during the conversation. So for example, let's say I was cold calling someone and I said, oh, hey, it's David here calling from Cerebral Selling. Do you have a few minutes to chat? And if you don't, that's okay too. Don't do that, right? I've given you the out too soon. But if I've added some value, if I've talked about how you can help you, if I've done all those great upfront things, giving you permission at the end, I mean, if it's going well, then, that's okay. Like, let's continue the conversation. But if you sense there might be some hesitation there, it's okay. Like, give them permission to say no, or give them permission to say not now. Remember, let's end this how we began at the beginning. We talked about how trust is this biochemical reaction, and people will remember how you treated them during these periods of adversity. So even giving them permission to say no and re-engage at another time is an act of kindness and something that they will remember when it is time to re-engage. So that was my crash course in selling during times of adversity. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Sales Lab Live. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance to what we talked about today, so hopefully this is just a bit of a primer and introduction for you, give you some things to think about and more research to do. But I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next episode.